In August of 1968, I was a Hatchet Force platoon leader at MACV-SOG's Mylock launch site. Somebody came up with an old version of Custer's Last Stand and a movie projector. We were watching it on the side of a tent. Near the end, as Custer was being wiped out, my interpreter stood up and said with disgust, "Why no get helicopter, get jet, come shoot Indian." Yes, it was funny, but to him it made perfect sense. This is Tuong. He was one of the highest paid mercenary soldiers during the Vietnam War. He was born into the Brew Montagnard tribe that occupied the remote jungle mountains of Laos during the World War II Japanese occupation of French Indochina. The Brew clung to a centuries-old existence, avoiding civilization. Tuong grew up in one of the tribe's hundreds of autonomous villages spread throughout the region. Wearing only a loincloth, he learned to fish and hunt and practice slash-and-burn agriculture. The tribe's remote location left them untouched by the events going on around them. While World War II ended, another began, the French were expelled, and Vietnam was divided, the Brew went about their lives peacefully, bearing the hardships of their ancient existence stoically. In 1958, the North Vietnamese and Pathet Lao attacked the small crossroads town of Che Pong, driving out the Laotian government garrison. Within months, the North Vietnamese began to occupy the Brew territory, building roads and way stations that would become the Ho Chi Minh Trail. When discovered, the Brew were pressed into forced labor. Over the following years, the Brew uprooted their villages and moved further and further east, finally occupying the mountainous area in northwest South Vietnam. Their arrival did not escape the surveillance of the Central Intelligence Agency. In 1962, they sent a Special Forces A-team to Kesan to establish a base and recruit a paramilitary force from the Brew tribe. The Special Forces made their first contacts through food and medical aid, then set about convincing the Brew to establish a military force for self-protection. At first, the Brew were skeptical, doubting they would be able to learn military skills. But faced with slavery to their west, many agreed to join the CIDG, the Civilian Irregular Defense Group. Tuong was among them. Historically, ancient tribes are modernized by being absorbed by an advanced population encroaching on their lands, with all the hostility and distrust that comes along with it. In the case of the Brew, they were able to maintain their lifestyle and customs because civilization came to them in the form of a small Special Forces A-team. None of the Brew spoke English, and only a half a dozen knew a few words of Vietnamese, but language was a problem the Special Forces had been trained to overcome. On the other hand, getting them to wear boots was a never-ending struggle. Surprisingly, they mastered military skills easily, and as could be expected from their sturdy build and mountain existence, they had no trouble carrying the heavy loads of an infantryman on long marches in difficult terrain. Soldiers of the Civilian Irregular Defense Group were paid about $10 each month, introducing the Brew to money for the first time. They bought brightly colored cloth and other trinkets from the Vietnamese in the small village of Kesan. Over the next 4 years, Tuong honed his military skills. Although contact with the enemy was rare, many of the Brew shied away from patrolling outside of the camp. Tuong was an exception. He enthusiastically patrolled and often walked point. He was given a leadership role, and it was said that he was the first Brew to carry an M16 rifle. With his field skill, outgoing personality, and constant smile, he became a favorite of the Americans, and even managed to learn a couple of hundred words of English. In January 1966, the North Vietnamese mortared the A camp, bringing the first Marine troops into the area. The buildup continued for the rest of the year, and by December, the Kesan combat base had been established. The Marines didn't trust the Brew, or any Vietnamese for that matter, so the A-team was moved to a new garrison at Long Vay, 4 miles to the west. Soon after, to the consternation of the Marines, the MACV-SOG launch site, which had been operating out of the airstrip at the old French fort 3 miles to the south, was relocated to the A camp on their perimeter, reinforced and designated FOB 3. To say the relationship was rocky from the start was an understatement. All of SOG's missions were classified top secret. As the Marine commanders tried to assert control, SOG's position was that what they were doing was none of the Marines' business, and ignored their directives. SOG needed troops, so they poached from the A-Camp CIDG, offering large sums of money to join their Special Commando unit. They explained to the Brew that their job would no longer be to defend the local area, but to conduct missions in North Vietnamese-held territory. Tuong signed up as an interpreter for $80 per month. He had no idea how much money that was, but in fact it was the equivalent to the pay of an ARVN officer or a successful South Vietnamese civilian. He was now, by definition, a mercenary. On the 21st of January, 1968, the battle for Kesan began. 2.5 weeks later, the A-Camp at Long Vay was overrun by North Vietnamese tanks. For the first time in the war, the Brew suffered heavy casualties. During the siege, SOG's commandos patrolled the NVA-held areas to the west in defiance of Marine orders, providing the only ground intelligence of the battle area. In early April, the combat base was relieved. 3 weeks later, the personnel from FOB-3 and their dependents were relocated 15 miles east to My Loc and redesignated a launch site for FOB-1. SOG Special Commandos had absolutely nothing in common with Hollywood's portrayal of mercenaries as bands of highly skilled, bloodthirsty killers. The Montagnards were, in fact, serviceable infantrymen with skill levels approximating those of an Army graduate from advanced infantry training. There were many different tribes, and a word of caution here. Special Forces soldiers formed very strong bonds with their yards, as they called them. Whether you worked with the Rod A, the Dry, or the Brew, you knew with zero doubt that yours were the best, even though you had no idea what the others were like. If you ever find yourself discussing Montagnards with a Special Forces soldier, treat them like you're talking about his mother, and you should be okay. At My Loc, Tuong was my interpreter and Brew leader. He could only speak a couple of hundred words of English, so we got along great. As was the Brew custom, he referred to himself in the third person. Tahan was the Brew word for soldier, so if I asked him where he was going, he'd reply, Tahan go village. This is Relang. As Tuong told me, Relang be point man. He was fearless and constantly alert. During the 14 months we were together, he never let the enemy get off the first shot in a chance encounter. He knew that if the NVA were set up for us, we would never see them first. So he looked for terrain that gave the enemy a distinct advantage. He'd turn to me, point, and whisper, no good, no good. Without Relang, I wouldn't be alive today. Aside from Relang, the Brew's knowledge of the enemy was disappointing. I'd ask them, VC go here. The answer was always, Tahan don't know. If we got into a firefight or saw signs of the enemy, I'd ask them how many VC. They'd always say beaucoup. Beaucoup, it turned out, meant anywhere from none to 10,000. Since many of them had been fighting for years, I figured they could have given me a little more help for Christ's sake. We learned pretty quickly that with the Brew, no matter how difficult the terrain, you had to move in some semblance of a fighting formation. Getting up, moving around during a firefight where everybody has automatic weapons may get you a medal, but it would much more likely just get you killed. We paid careful attention to our machine gun locations. Once under fire, the Brew would hang in there with us, keeping their heads up, searching for targets, and laying down fire. But even with a lull, it was almost impossible to get them to maneuver, which was a vast improvement over the Cambodians I had worked with before, who in a difficult situation would cut and run on you in a heartbeat, which really shouldn't be surprising. Almost everyone who has ever reported on mercenary fighters tell us that they are only reliable as long as they are winning. That was not the case with the Brew. They would hang in with us even in the most dire circumstances. Their number one attribute in combat was loyalty. One time I jokingly said to Tuong, "The only reason you're sticking around is because I've got the radio that gets the jets and the helicopters." He laughed, then turned serious, and thumped his chest with a fist, saying, "Brew be Tahan." It was his way of expressing duty and honor. We were stuck in Laos with bad weather, no air support, low on ammunition, outnumbered, and the NVA had just brought up a 60mm mortar to make things more interesting. You know, typical SOG shit. I later learned that one of the Brew was quietly saying they should leave the Americans and melt off into the jungle. By later, I mean I learned about it right after he was killed in the first minutes of our next operation. Brew Justice was harsh. The relationship between the Montagnards and the Vietnamese wasn't complicated. They didn't like each other one little bit. The Montagnards were intimidated by the Vietnamese advanced civilization. The Vietnamese, for their part, looked down on the Montagnards, calling them Moi, a pejorative term that meant savage. At Fort Bragg, we had learned about the hostility between the groups, but at My Loc it wasn't apparent because the only Vietnamese in the area occupied a couple of small farming villages which seemed to exist simply to supply rice for the North Vietnamese army. After 6 months working with the Brew, we had had more than our fair share of operations in Laos and spent even more time running ambush patrols around the local villages. The platoon had become very combat effective. They weren't Army Ranger effective, but they were good. We were scheduled for a mission into Laos, south of Route 9, a few miles west of the old Long Vay camp. At the last minute, word came down that we were limited to taking 12 men. It was the second time it happened, so I knew better than to argue. I also knew nobody was counting and I could put 7 guys on each slick, so I took the point squad, both the other Americans, and added a second machine gun team. The weather was lousy, but SOG was trying to dump every team across the border they could to build up the numbers for the month. After a 2-day weather hold, they found a hole in the clouds big enough to insert us. The weather stayed spotty, air support was limited, and recon teams kept declaring prairie fire emergencies, so I knew better than to get aggressive. The weather got worse, and they finally pulled us out on the 10th day. As we gained altitude, we were enveloped in clouds. Visibility dropped to nothing. One look at the crew chief told me I wasn't the only one thinking about slamming into a mountain. After a few horrifying minutes, we broke out of the clouds into bright sunshine. It was a view you usually get from a jetliner, except I was sitting in the door with my feet hanging out. I could see the other chopper just ahead of us. Pretty soon we were freezing cold. The crew chief closed the doors. I thanked him. He told me they were running out of fuel and were going to drop us off as soon as they could find a spot to land. 15 minutes later, the 14 of us were standing on a small helipad in Quang Tri. I don't think any of the Brew had ever been to a city. Tuong came up to me and said, "Tahan, can do eat?" We had run out of rations a few days before, so we set off down the sidewalk looking for food. Bicycles and Lambrettas were going by. Pedestrians scurried out of our way. Young guys on Hondas were yelling Moi at the Brew, so they started walking weapons up like in the jungle. We quickly found the MACV-Arvin compound, and without too much rifle pointing, got a Vietnamese sergeant at the gate to take us to the mess hall. On the way we heard catcalls from the Arvin soldiers, and the Brew instinctively spread out. I was beginning to think this wasn't my best decision. The cooks weren't happy to see us either. I gave some guy 3 500 piastre notes, and pretty soon we were eating rice and some kind of vegetables. "Who's in charge here?" a voice boomed. I looked up and saw a bright and shiny MACV captain, all decked out with a maroon beret, fatigues with lots of patches, and a shoulder holster for dramatic effect. "I am," I said softly. "Who are you people?" Of course I couldn't tell him, and the fact that we had no insignia, dog tags, or ID cards wasn't going to help. I was hoping he would look at us, see all our firepower, and figure out we were some kind of special operation, and offer to help us any way he could, but that was way too much to ask. So he ended up sitting in a chair, getting acquainted with Verlang's icy stare. When we finished, we had the captain escort us to the gate, where he got stupid again, but none of the Vietnamese got killed. We found an airfield, and with the help of a Special Forces E-8, we were back at My Loc late the next day. The Brew's first encounter with Vietnamese civilization demonstrated the wisdom of our remote My Loc base. So, of course, SOG closed it down and moved us all to Da Nang a month later. You will find my book Dawsons War worthwhile. Rather than just accounts of MACV-SOG's various missions, Dawsons War is the story of 5 men, 3 Americans and 2 Brew Mountain Yard mercenaries. I'll take you with us for a year. You'll get your fair share of gunfights in Laos, because we did. But SOG was so much more than gunfights. SOG was a brotherhood, and unless you experience the camaraderie we shared, you can't really know SOG. Through Dawsons War, these 5 men will become your friends, and like we do, you'll miss them when it's over. In the end, you'll be able to answer SOG's most asked question: what kind of men ran these dangerous missions? Get a copy today at Amazon. Hey, do me a favor, like and subscribe. It helps. Thanks.